Good afternoon, Dr. Shakaria. Nice to meet you today.
Likewise.
Uh, you are now very popular in China for your research on ISIS. Within days after Paris terrorist attack, your article has been published in China, and many people read your article and they are very interested in your research. Because right now the ISIS become a world enemy. They are trying to uh, fight against the human civilization, including China and the United States. So I think this interview may be very helpful for our readers to better know you and your research. Could you please give us a brief introduction about yourself?
Yeah, sure. I attended West Point right out of high school, and then from after I left West Point, I was active duty in the U.S. Army. I spent over 2 years in Iraq working in Operation Iraqi Freedom, doing counterinsurgency operations. After my second tour in Iraq, I was selected for a program to go back to graduate school to get my PhD, which I got in computer science from the University of Maryland. And I specialized in applying artificial intelligence techniques to problems dealing with international security, specifically terrorism and counterinsurgency. After that, I taught for about 3 years at West Point to finish up my military time, and then I took a job here at ASU uh, as an assistant professor in computer science, and that's what I've been doing for the last year and a half.
I have to say your research is very fascinating. Before I read your paper yesterday, I couldn't even thought about linking the artificial intelligence with counter-terrorism together. So how did you begin your research in this intersection of quite different di- and distinct areas?
Well, it kind of started when I was in Iraq. Um, at the time, my first tour in Iraq in 2003, computers were being employed throughout the Army more than any time in the past. So when soldiers would come back from patrol, their reports were getting typed up and often put in a database. And since I studied computer science as an undergraduate, I often wondered, what can we do with all this data? Are there little gems in there that we can use that can really help us combat this terrorist threat? So I thought about this a lot over my time in combat, and when I started graduate school, I started applying these ideas in software to see how best, to see, which of these ideas can actually make an impact. The most recent work um, stems from the idea that ISIS is rather new type of adversary. They're running a mini state. They are doing terrorist operations. They're fighting like conventional military. So they're doing a bunch of different things, and they're doing them all simultaneously. So it defies a lot of conventional wisdom. In our past work, we often relied on finding uh, correlations to model the behavior of terror groups. However, in finding correlations, you could often find coincidences. With ISIS, or with previous groups, we got over the coincidences by relying on human experts to evaluate what we found in the data. However, we don't have that luxury so much with ISIS, so we had to come up with ways to better determine if a cause and effect noted in their behavior was causal or if it just was a coincidence. And that was what the point of the most recent work was.
I also noticed that your research is primarily rely on open source data from a DC-based think tank, and your research itself is publicly available, and your research was run on a regular commodity computer. So what if ISIS know what you are doing and then try to change their course when they figure out that you already know how they do their job, and why do you think it is worthy to make your research public?
Well, this is always a fair question, and it's always an interesting one to explore. Um, Making research public is First off, that's something that's very important within the DoD here in the United States. Basic research is designed to create a fertile ground for more applied efforts that result in systems being deployed. Our work, we rely on open sources and applying these to it because we want to keep the work um, generally accessible. Now, can ISIS take our results and modify their behavior? Well, in theory they could, but you have to consider a couple of things. First of all, um, that ISIS operates with a lot of constraints. They're not magical in any way where they can shift what they do on a whim. So it's actually, especially in light of the paper that was recently published, it's very difficult for them to shift course. The other thing too is that our hope is that some of these methods get adopted within the DoD and similar organizations and get applied to more complete data sets outside of the one we use in the Washington think tank. And this data typically will be classified and the results would not be shared with the public. The other thing too that I would also argue is it wasn't the case in the ISIS paper, but it's true in a lot of my other work, is based on ideas of game theory or adversarial reasoning, in which case you identify ways to change friendly behavior such that you limit what the adversary can do even when they're most powerful. So regardless of if they have the algorithm available at that time, you're still guaranteed that you've constrained their behavior because there's nothing they can do about it.
Okay. And this study consists of a data set of 2,200 incidents of military activities. So how do you select the useful data for analyzing the military strategy of ISIS out of a huge amount of seemingly arbitrary data?
So that's a good point. So what we did with the data, we had these 2,200 incidents over a 6-month period, and we were looking to identify spikes in certain types of attack behaviors. And so we were looking at, well, what caused the spikes? And it usually would be a combination of a couple different variables. Now, with such a large data set, you're going to find more than one potential cause. So which one is a cause and which one is a coincidence? Well, what was in our paper, what we did was we had ways to compare various causes or various potential causes, and ones that sort of bubbled up to the top that would consistently increase the likelihood of the effect occurring. Those are the ones we talked about most in the paper as being most important.
And you also used APT logic, rule learning, and causal reasoning in the study, but it's a little bit hard for regular people to understand. Could you explain how these algorithms work in plain world for
Yes,
ordinary people?
so it's actually quite simple. The APT rule learning strategy, that's what identifies the correlations, and the algorithms for APT rule learning, that was developed by me back when I was a graduate student in Maryland a few years back. The causal inference methodology we use is based on the work of some researchers out of Stevens Institute in New Jersey, and that is what we use for one of the comparison mechanisms. And so that's how those work together. We find the correlations and then we compare them to see which of the potential causes or hypothesized causes are most likely would lead to the effect.
And there seems to be other relative factors like circumstance, weather, and political condition which need to be considered. How did you deal with them in your research? Or you just put them aside and focus on?
No, we looked at a wide variety of variables here that were in this particular data set. Now, while we didn't have as much of the political and external environmental variables as we would have liked, that could certainly be added in and used with the same paradigm. but the type of variables we used were primarily from the reports we encoded, which had to do with things like where an infantry attack occurred, where a roadside bombing occurred, where a terror attack occurred, and so forth.
So in the report it only includes such information, but that didn't talk about the weather or political conditions, things like that.
Right. So
Okay.
that stuff, there's no reason that can't be added and reasoned about with the same framework.
Mm-hmm.
But we didn't do that in this
Okay.
particular paper.
Sure. And I wonder what's the differences between ISIS military strategy and other terrorist groups like Al Qaeda.
Yeah, well, I think the key difference is ISIS, um, they have more immediate goals of controlling territory as opposed to Al Qaeda. And this leads to a change in military tactics. I touched on earlier that these guys, they're running a state, doing conventional military operations in addition to insurgent and terror operations as well, where Al Qaeda is really more focused on the latter two. And they weren't really looking to themselves set up a state, and setting up a state sort of necessitates doing conventional military operations, things like infantry and artillery and so forth. So, and that's really why we felt this work with the causal rule learning was important, because we couldn't see from Al Qaeda actions, when they're making decisions to switch from, say, conventional tactics to terror tactics, because they're not really doing both. Where ISIS, since they're doing both, we can see in certain cases how they use terror tactics to augment their conventional capability. Like, for instance, we believe that, based on the study, that ISIS would tend to use car bombs, especially in Baghdad,
Mm-hmm.
to divert security forces when they're doing a conventional operation in a different part of the country. So right there you got conventional tactics where they're trying to gain territory using infantry guys in one part of the country, and then, say, normally in Baghdad they're doing terror stuff through the car bombs because they don't want the reinforcements to come from Baghdad to where they're doing infantry stuff, because that hurts their goals of
Mm-hmm.
setting up a state.
So they are basically taking advantage of two kinds of strategy: the conventional strategy and the insurgent and terrorism.
Exactly. And I think basically, well, at least within the confines of the Middle East, is they're really looking to reduce the opponent's capability to move forces to counter their conventional operations. So that's, I think, what's going on there.
Your study also summarized some rules. For example, after airstrike, they are more likely to use the vehicle bombs, and have American and other Western countries ever changed their modus operandi and follow such rules to attack ISIS at this point?
So, so I think what's going on there with coalition and even Iraqi airstrikes. So, really the trend that we saw in the study was ISIS going to use smaller munitions like roadside bombs and suicide attacks that leave a much smaller signature in the preparation phase. So, as opposed to things that are more easily targetable, like setting up a car bomb, that leaves a huge intelligent signature by comparison. How would that change U.S. strategy knowing something like this? Well, I think the key is realizing is that, hey, if we're doing heavy airstrikes and then we're expecting an ISIS campaign, that campaign may still take place, but in the form of using IEDs. So maybe then we need to coordinate with our partners on the ground, such as the Iraqi army, to do things like conduct mine clearing operations. So just like ISIS is using different kind of tactics being pieced together, we have to work with our coalition partners to come up with the right response when these sort of things happen.
So is your research being used in the military strategy making process? I just wonder if it is classified. Don't let me know.
Yeah, so well, the knowledge is out there. I've been talking with people within the DoD about ways to transition this as a general technique that could be used in DoD systems, but that's ongoing. But yeah, you wouldn't find out in the open media if
Mhm.
it's that someone's actually using those results.
Uh, the ISIS right now is planning more terrorist attack in Europe right now, and maybe because of their retreat in Syria and Iraq. From early 2014 to June 2015, they have lost almost 10% of their territory. Could we use some technical approach to testify this assumption, namely the causal relationship between the ISIS terrorist attack abroad and its retreat in Syria and Iraq, like what you have done in this research?
Yeah, the problem with the approach in the current research is it relies heavily on historical data. So for things like, you know, in 2014, the data we have there was based on a military campaign, and so during that time, ISIS does a lot of the same things over and over again. They launch a artillery attack, then they follow it with infantry. They augment it with terror in another city, for instance, and so forth. And since they do this a bunch of times over a 6 month period, we can identify if-then relationships. The problem with terror incidents in another country is that they're isolated incidents, um, and so they they don't happen with frequency enough that we can discern a pattern like this. And the same thing goes for ISIS losing territory. Now, one thing you could look at though is you could look at how ISIS where they're at in controlling things, and when you come up across a new situation, so let's say that, hey, we've just noticed that ISIS has lost control of this amount of territory and it's happened pretty rapidly and it's never happened before, then we could maybe expect that something bigger would be on, that they might try to do something about it, such as launch a series of terror attacks. But yeah, we have not looked into that in particular.
So there are still some limits for big data research in this area.
Well, I would say the limits I described were just to what was proposed in my paper.
Mhm.
Um, there is other research that looks at things like, hey, when is an outlier occur? When are you in a new situation you haven't been in before? And there are others who have done stuff like that. Just to my knowledge, they have not applied it to a group like ISIS.
Apart from this, could this method being used in this research be adopted in other area about that the ISIS or other terrorist groups?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's very important to identify an aspect of causality when modeling any of these groups, because it gives you better insight uh, into why they do what they do. So I think there's potential future. Yeah.
Since ISIS is still our imminent threat, I wonder whether this research is uh, still advancing. Do you collect new data, maybe classify right now
Um,
to assist with the
well, like I said,
collaboration?
we're for this particular effort, we're talking with some people within the DoD about potential next steps. We also have another effort at ASU where we're looking at spread of extremist messages in social media under what's called the Minerva program, and that was recently funded, and we're starting to look into that stuff as well.
Yeah, actually, that's I'm trying to ask. Right now, you are trying to figure out the mechanism of ISIS recruitment on the social network in order to stop them. So could you please give us some details about that?
Yeah, so this is a very big project, and it's not just about ISIS, it's more extremism in general, although we are including ISIS as one of the extremist groups we're investigating. Um, the idea is that we, in my group, we've identified methods for detecting viral trends in social media early on. But we think these methods can be, but the methods don't consider the content of the messages themselves, and and they also don't consider the culture in which the viral trend is occurring. So by augmenting these techniques with studies by anthropologists to get a better handle on content and culture, as well as better leveraging big data, we think we can take this to the next step to more early identify things that will catch on in social media, and that we think that will help a lot with some of these issues on recruitment using social media for extremist groups.
But I see there's a potential ethic issue here. This technique can be used not only to fight against ISIS, but it might be used against someone. Maybe it can be used by someone in the government to infringe our freedom of speech enshrined by the First Amendment. It seems like there's always a tension between the national security and the individual freedom, especially after the Snowden revelation. So could such technique be even more dangerous than the threat for which it was created to fight against?
I don't think this technique in particular, no. And again, it goes back to the fact we're publishing this in the open literature, for one, and two is we're just researching what causes these viral trends to spread before they become widespread. And so, so that we're not in that work, we're not looking at how to take a proactive action to actually stop. So, so I don't think that the
So you think
ethical thing.
you think basically this technique is neutral, but depends on who is gonna to use it.
Well, I mean, I think what's going to happen is techniques for identifying viral trends early on. Um, there's also other groups that develop things like this as well. Uh, I think this is such a wide variety of uses. I don't think um, it makes sense to classify it as ethical or non-ethical, especially when the majority of use cases are based on social media, which isn't open anyway. So we're not looking to pry into people's accounts or anything like this. So it's just looking at, hey, how is stuff spreading now? And is that indicative of that it's going to become widespread? Um, so that's that's really uh, different than something where it's saying, hey, this algorithm is going to stop this trend, or this software is going to sneak into people's private communications. We're not doing either of those things. So.
Actually, may I off the record for a moment? Actually, I asked this question because since your publication become public available eventually, I just wonder, for example, other country like China or North Korea or Iran, they get this technique. They use this technique to find out or to try to stop people talking about things they don't really like on the internet.
Yeah, I mean that's possible. Yeah, I thought about that a lot too, talking to all these Chinese reporters lately. But I mean, if they're censoring stuff as it is, I don't know what difference that makes.
Yeah. Okay. Days ago, maybe no, skip this question. So are there other projects about ISIS now around the nation? Do you have any collaboration with them? Are you also
Um, so yeah, I mean, we were working with a couple external partners on the Minerva grant, in particular, Exeter in the UK, as well as Luke Curtis, who was out of West Point. Um, and there's other people as well who have been looking at some of these problems. Um, Here at ASU, also Steve Corman has been looking into some aspects of ISIS narratives. Um, so it's of course a very important topic, and rightfully so lately.
Based on other article discussing this research, your colleague Dr. Davuku mentioned there are aerial experts in Southeast Asia in your team. Are these experts also from ASU since our school is trying to advance interdisciplinary research?
Yeah, so he's primarily referring to the anthropologist Mark Woodward, who's leading our ethnographic effort as part of the Minerva project. So he's actually going to go in the field in some of these countries, and his research will enable us to improve our methods on social media because we'll understand the cultural context in which these messages are spreading better.
I noticed that in your research there are a couple countries are included. There are 9 countries included in this research. So why these 9 countries? And there is even no USA yet.
Well, in general, we like to avoid looking at the U.S. for DoD research because, in gen, we don't want to have give people the impression that the DoD is creating research to somehow monitor the citizens of the United States. Um, the other countries were selected so we could get sort of a bit of a sample of different parts of the globe. So that's why we look at Europe and the Middle East and Asia and Africa. So, that was the thinking there.
And I noticed that in your research, those countries don't include Afghanistan and Pakistan. These 2 countries are also very important Muslim country, in my opinion. I just wonder how you select those countries in your research. Why you choose these 9?
Well, it had more to do with we can't there's many other countries that would have been interesting to explore besides the ones we listed. So, for example, the Ukraine would have also been cool, and with probably Colombia as well, or even Mexico. But because all of these places also have important conflicts. At the end of the day, this is scientific research, and we have to do things within a budget, so we could only pick so many.
Okay. And okay, that's basically all the question. I'm personally curious why you moved from West Point to ASU.
It's the weather, man. It gets summer all year round.
Okay, yeah. Actually, I'm also from New York, so I love the weather here. Okay. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you.